So this is a clear crime against humanity. And the Chinese government was just, trying to deny it and so forth. When we tried to put just a discussion of Xinjiang on the agenda of the UN Human Rights Council, it was so terrifying to the Chinese government that it might be condemned by a UN institution that Xi Jinping himself was making phone calls to heads of state to lobby against us. And this just shows, how powerful this effort can be. Some people, when they, hear me talk, say, well, weren't you talking about a different era? I mean, how do you shame people today? Which, is a fair question. And obviously, one of the real techniques of today's populist autocrat is to single out some group that is unpopular with at least the majority in the country and demonize that group. So it can be immigrants, it can be LGBT people. I mean, there's always somebody, Muslims. And so how do you, shame a government that is actually proud of a part of its human rights abuses? And it's described in the book, how we address this. I mean, I talk about one case in Cairo where the police were basically soliciting gay men on the internet, picking them up and torturing them. And when we went to our local partner in Egypt, they said, don't touch this. It's too sensitive, Now, we ignored them, but we decided to proceed, strategically. And so instead of singling out this particular victim, we issued a report about torture of a variety of victims and looked at, Islamists who were being tortured and dissidents who were being tortured. And by the way, gay men who were being tortured. And in that context, it worked. The torture stopped. And it just, was a matter of, how do you portray it? We got, various members of the US Congress, which is a big funder of the Egyptian government, to write to the government and say, this is not a good idea, and these sorts of things were successful in ending the practice. These are ways in which, even in a situation where a particular leader is, making abuse popular, we can make a difference. Now, do governments really care? I describe how one big campaign that Human Rights Watch led involved the Uyghurs, who were a Muslim minority in Xinjiang, the large northwestern region of China, where the Chinese government has locked up 1 million of the 11 million Uyghurs to try to force them to abandon their culture, their language, and their religion. So this is a clear crime against humanity. And the Chinese government was just, trying to deny it and so forth. When we tried to put just a discussion of Xinjiang on the agenda of the UN Human Rights Council, it was so terrifying to the Chinese government that it might be condemned by a UN institution that Xi Jinping himself was making phone calls to heads of state to lobby against us. And this just shows, how powerful this effort can be. Now, can you shame in a post-truth world? I mean, is that what we're in? And it is a more difficult world. When I started this, there were a handful of media outlets which had, journalists and editors who largely were concerned about the truth. And so they would, filter out the propaganda and the disinformation. Today, it's very different. Today there is a much broader media landscape. There's social media. There are whole governments that have teams of AI-enhanced bots that flood social media. So it's more difficult. But I actually think that there is still a quest for facts, for the truth, on behalf of a significant segment of society, including the movable middle, which often determines how a government proceeds. And ironically, I think the most powerful evidence of the significance of truth today comes from Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. And why do I say this? Because each of them oversees an incredibly complex disinformation machine. But neither of them trusts that to be sufficient to persuade their people. They both continue to be fearful that their people will gain access to the truth, and so they censor. Xi Jinping has the Great Firewall. Vladimir Putin has large censorship machinery. they're still afraid of the truth. And that for me is, a powerful reason to still try to disseminate the truth. Now, what do you do with somebody like Trump, who is in some ways beyond shame? I mean, if you to say, if you say, Donald Trump, you're violating human rights, he'll say, what are those? So, a frontal approach isn't ideal. But even Trump is shameable. This is a guy who has an incredibly fragile ego. And he, has certain ways in which he thinks he is brilliant, which gives us something to work with. So, Trump, the master negotiator, the art of the deal. How do you affect this guy? You point out that he's being utterly naive, that he's being bamboozled by the likes of Putin in Ukraine or Netanyahu in Gaza. And that he's, the wool is being pulled over his eyes. And that is, a way where actually I think with some success, we've pushed him to gradually, toughen up on Putin a bit, to contemplate the U.S. providing security guarantees for a European peacekeeping force in Ukraine. It's how in Gaza, even though he still is green-lighting Netanyahu's genocide, he is, distancing himself from Netanyahu in certain respects. He criticized the recent attack on the Hamas negotiators in Qatar. He's repudiated Netanyahu's false claim of no starvation in Gaza. There are various signs that there's kind of no love lost between these two guys. And of course, Trump, because he's always foremost concerned with himself, reads the polls and sees that esteem for Israel is plummeting in the United States, including among Republicans. And there will come a time when, it's just not worth it to him. And so Netanyahu's view that he can sort of put up with the condemnation of the world so long as he has the support of Donald Trump is a very risky strategy for him. So I think that, even with a Trump, there is, movement that is possible. Let me make one last point and then I will open it up to your questions. Many people ask me, isn't this a bad time for human rights? Because look what's happening to democracy. Aren't the autocrats winning? And to be honest, I think that is a very Western perspective. It's a perspective that is understandable as we're sitting here in an established democracy. It's not how it's seen in much of the world. And let me explain. I think there's no doubt that in the established democracies today, we have a democracy problem. We have many people from the working class in particular who feel that they are left behind. That they're economically stagnating, that government is not listening to them, acting for them, respecting them. And these are the people who were ripe for the autocrats' appeal. They are the supporters of Donald Trump or Nigel Farage or the AfD or Marine Le Pen. And we clearly, in our established democracies, must do a better job of ensuring that they serve everybody and not just a dominant elite. But if you look at the reaction of people around the world who live under autocracy, they almost uniformly want out. And we've seen this manifest itself in huge demonstrations against autocracy for democracy in country after country after country in recent years. Now, sometimes these demonstrations work. So most recently, we saw the ouster of Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh. We saw the removal of the Rajapaksa dynasty in Sri Lanka. Bolsonaro was deposed in Brazil. The Law and Justice Party lost power in Poland. South Korea, an effort by the president to launch a constitutional coup was reversed by a popular uprising. So, sometimes the end result is positive. Often the government is so willing to use force to repress an uprising that the uprising fails. So that was, the women, freedom, life movement in Iran. That's what happened in Russia, in Belarus, Uganda, Nicaragua. So these uprisings don't always work, but it's clear where people stand. And these, post-uprising governments are hanging on essentially by the barrel of a gun. And that is a very risky strategy. Look at Bashar al-Assad, who was as repressive as they come, but when the HTS rebels started moving on Damascus, nobody came to his rescue. Nobody wanted him. He was utterly unpopular. And so, that's what Putin is terrified of, a color revolution. And so I feel that, the defense of democracy, which really means the defense of governments that are accountable to the people, that where the people have some capacity to move them, that we are, on the side of people. And I just saw a panel earlier today where one of the panelists said, oh, the people of China, they love the Communist Party dictatorship. And, nobody said, well, what about Hong Kong? Where hundreds of thousands of people, when given the choice, said, absolutely not. The last thing we want is the dictatorship of the Chinese Communist Party. That, I think, is pretty uniformly true of people who live under autocracy. And so that gives me hope. That makes me feel that, we're kind of on the right side of history here. It doesn't mean we necessarily win, but it means that this effort is very much worthwhile. And it's that effort that I describe in the book.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below.
With a free trial, you can enjoy the full talk and thousands more.
Thank you for being part of the conversation.